Why do great manga have bad paneling? I say this because you never really think about paneling, but everyone knows good paneling when they see it, which is a shame because paneling is what makes manga manga. It's the reason manga is more than just a storyboard for anime. Paneling opens up a whole new world of creativity that very few artists know how to use. And nobody uses this medium better than the creator of Chainsaw Man, Tatsuki Fujimoto. That's why in this video, I'd like to talk about the importance of good paneling, discuss how it's used in different manga, and explain how Fujimoto has mastered manga's unique brand of creativity. Naturally, to start off the discussion, it's only fair that we start with a proper definition of paneling, especially considering how many people like to use it to describe just about everything from sequencing to choreography, when that's just not true. Actually, we have a few things to define. First of all, we need to talk about the structure of panels, because panels are what make manga manga. It's the reason you don't read manga and just see a bunch of one-page panels. The space between those panels is what's referred to in comics as the gutter, and the gutter is where closure takes place, which is just a fancy way of describing the way readers use their imagination to fill in the gaps. It's the difference between watching a scene as it's completely animated in a cartoon and reading select moments of that scene and using the gutter to fill in the blanks on your own. That's closure. Now, that was a bunch of fancy words to describe something you basically already knew, so why am I bringing this up? Well, the reason the gutter is so important is because it allows the reader to become an active participant in the story. In animation, you get to see the whole scene play out, but adding more to the scene takes away your ability to imagine the scene for yourself. The empty space between panels allows you to imagine the speed of a punch, the power of an attack, even emotions of a character. Clearly, how well an artist uses the gutter translates to the reader's experience. The more you allow readers to participate in meaningful ways, the more engaged they feel when reading a story. There's different kinds of panel-to-panel transitions or paneling, such as action to action, moment to moment, aspect to aspect, and a bunch more. How the artist organizes transitions from one panel to another leads to certain possibilities for readers. So the more deliberate the artist is in their paneling, the more readers will feel engaged. Another element to consider is sequencing. While paneling usually refers to these panel-to-panel transitions, sequencing refers to the way artists illustrate time. Manga is a sequential art, so sequencing is just as important as paneling. And sequencing doesn't just refer to the passage of time through several panels. It also refers to the passage of time in a single panel. If you draw a panel longer than the other panels on a page, if you change the border of a particular panel, or if you leave the panel open and don't complete that basic rectangle, you can portray different experiences of time. Sequencing plays into these panel-to-panel experiences, which is why so many people include it when they talk about paneling. But I bring it up because it's a separate consideration that's just as important. In any event, this is what we mean when we're talking about paneling. The transitions between panels, the gutter that influences our imagination, the sequence in and between panels, and the composition of those panels. All of these create certain experiences for readers. So the better an artist can make use of panels, the better they can make use of the medium. And nobody makes use of this medium quite like Tatsuki Fujimoto. But real quick, before I say more on that, make sure to join the channel if you're enjoying the video. You get custom badges and emojis to show off during our weekly live streams, and you can even pick which series I cover next. Now, when you see people talk about paneling in Chainsaw Man, they're usually talking about two things. Either this kind of sequence where a character just sort of deadpans, or they're talking about choreography. And choreography is a big part of why the action in Chainsaw Man is so great, but it's not the only part. As you can imagine, paneling is another big part. You can see this right away in Chapter 1. In this scene, Denji is attacking the zombie devil. At first glance, it kind of seems like two different different subjects, but it's the same zombie devil. In the left panel is the end result where the zombie devil has lost his eye. Fujimoto is showing one scene in two different moments in time, the beginning and the end. But notice how these panels blur together. There is a line to separate the pages, but it's overtaken by Denji punching through the zombie devil. This is emphasized by the screaming that escapes outside of the second page. So you have both a sequence of panels to illustrate time, as well as a blurring of panels that illustrate speed, motion, and pain. This is why manga is so special. You can't really do this kind of thing in anime because it's always just one frame, one sequence. But because you have panels and the gutter, you can manipulate the passage of time and space in manga, or in this case, blend them together. Now, this is one example of how Fujimoto uses paneling in a direct form of expression, but he also loves to use paneling for indirect expression as well. Although I should note that this is a spoiler for anime fans, so you may want to skip to this part of the video. One of my favorite scenes is when we find out Reze speaks Russian, and we find this out because she sings a song that is written in Russian. Now, considering you probably don't speak Russian if you live in Japan or the US, this creates an invisible wall, so to speak. Unless you can read Russian, you have no idea what Reze is saying. All you know is that she's singing. But there's two things that Fujimoto does that gives us non-Russian speaking readers some control over the scene. First of all, he cuts away from Reze for most of the song and shows us a sequence of panels that takes us through the empty school. It's not a non sequitur, but there's really no apparent meaning to this sequence either. This leaves a ton of room for the reader to insert their own interpretation of what this could mean. He also changes the word bubbles from the normal oval to cloud shapes. These clouds create connections to thoughts and imagination rather than the spoken word. So even if you can't read Russian, you get some idea that Reze's song might be some kind of fictional expression. And that sense of imagination is built up by the blank canvas that is the school. It's a brilliant combination of taking away meaning from readers while also giving meaning to them at the same time. Now, there's a bunch of other great examples of paneling in Chainsaw Man. In particular, I think the introduction of the Darkness Devil is a masterpiece. But I think you get the idea. Fujimoto manipulates the panels in every way he possibly can to express explicit ideas, and he uses panels so that readers can interpret the manga in their own way, something that can rarely be said of your typical action series. That being said, not every action series has lazy paneling. In fact, some of the most action-heavy series have the best paneling. And of course, when we're talking about good paneling, we need to talk about Jujutsu Kaisen. Jujutsu Kaisen is obviously one of the most popular series ever, but it wasn't until Gojo vs. Toji that the series really blew up. And when you look at the paneling in this fight, you can see why. One thing that stands out in this fight is the use of word bubbles. When Gojo uses red glow, it takes on this warped shape that escapes and divides the borders of the panels. Rather than combine a typical word bubble in a separate attack, Akutami makes the word bubble the attack. This emphasizes the overwhelming power of red glow, which we can see by the giant laser on the next page. Akutami does this again when Gojo uses hollow purple. It's worth mentioning that this time, the word bubble doesn't even have an aura shape. Instead, now we're meant to focus on the blank white space, which cues us into the nature of hollow purple. As we know, it's basically a black hole that erases everything it touches, so this focus on empty space rather than aura emphasizes this idea. On top of that, Akutami draws Gojo and Toji side by side. Obviously, the gutter is typically used as a space in between panels, but here, this is really just one big panel. With Gojo and Toji side by side, it removes any sequence. Instead, we're shown an attack that has an instant effect on Toji, rather than a sequence that takes place over two panels. So, it may not exactly be on the level of Fujimoto, but Akutami is just as creative when it comes to paneling, especially in these kinds of action scenes. But he also does this kind of thing in more mundane scenes as well. Earlier in the chapter, we see Toji stretching. The page consists of two panels separated by a ton of empty space, and Toji is stretching in the gutter. Now, there's a couple of things to note here. First, the top panel bleeds, so it isn't in a complete rectangle like the bottom panel. This blurs the border between Toji's space and the space outside of the page. In turn, this creates a sort of timelessness. In other words, we can't say for sure how long Toji is just standing there. Following this, we transition to Toji in the gutter. But with Toji in the gutter rather than any one panel, we also don't have any real idea of how long he's stretching. So on this page, Akutami manipulates the borders of the panels to drag out the sequencing. By opening and manipulating the borders of the panels, we get the feeling that this moment of Toji stretching and reflecting is timeless. There's a lot of instances where Akutami draws characters outside of the panels, but this example is a bit more subtle. But subtlety isn't always important in paneling. In fact, it's kind of the opposite. When it comes to paneling, we have a sort of hierarchy of attention. Most of our attention is directed to what's inside the panels. That's where the pretty pictures are. Then we pay attention to the transitions. That's where we either consciously or unconsciously fill in the blanks. Then the shapes of the panels are kind of an afterthought. This is why action manga typically have simple paneling. Think about it. If I'm drawing this intense action scene, but I also decide to draw it with these really intricate borders for each panel, the borders are going to distract you from the action. That being said, if you're going to be creative while paneling, you really have to be bold about it. That scene where Denji attacks the zombie devil is very in your face. There are subtle details, but it's obvious that the two pages blend together in a bizarre way. And in the Reze scene, you are very aware that Reze is speaking Russian. Fujimoto adds subtle details that are easy to miss, like the shapes of the word bubbles, but the Russian text shakes readers awake and makes them pay extra close attention. Readers don't usually focus on the details of paneling, so you need to be bold if you're trying to express something. And when we're talking about bold paneling, one of the best examples is Kamome Shirahama's work in Witch Hat Atelier. Witch Hat Atelier is a fantasy that's full of magic. One of the ways Shirahama indirectly expresses this fantasy tone is through the art style. Rather than a simple style or a photorealistic style, Shirahama draws the characters and scenery in a style that you might find in an old picture book. Trees will be like half sketched in and half detailed, and shadowing is usually done with lots of pencil lines instead of complete shadows. In addition to this, Shirahama also makes full use of the paneling. In this example from chapter 1, we can see that Shirahama adds detail to every part of the page. The top half of the page consists of a framed picture of a castle. The frame is surrounded by decorative branches and ribbons like the page of a storybook. At the top, we start with a panel of the main character in the present, then a panel of that same character when she was little. And because of the amount of space in between these panels, we understand the gap in time between the present and the past. Then we transition to the next part of the flashback, which consists of a panel drawn literally like a page in a book. Then when we cut back to the present, we see the characters in a very plain panel that contrasts with everything else. By drawing the panels in this ornate way, Shirahama enhances this fantasy experience. The panels look and feel like the pages in a storybook. As a result, we as readers intuitively understand that the world of Witch Hat is like a storybook. But this subtle trick is only achieved through not so subtle paneling. These panels are incredibly detailed because it takes that kind of focus to make readers pay attention to the paneling. Otherwise, we perceive the panels like any other sequence. Really, it's this balancing of direct expression and subtlety that makes great paneling. Not so simple that there's no creativity, but not so overbearing that it takes away from the subject matter and doesn't leave room for readers' imagination. Now, like I already talked about, Fujimoto is constantly doing this in Chainsaw Man, and he does it in all of his stories like Fire Punch and Look Back. It's just his thing. But his magnum opus when it comes to paneling is another one of his one-shots, Goodbye Eri. And I don't want to talk about this story too much because there's a lot of twists, but basically the whole story is supposed to be one big movie. The main character is always recording everything, so the idea is that each panel is the movie that he's making. It's funny because I say this is a masterpiece in paneling, but on the surface, Goodbye Goodbye Eri has some of the most boring paneling you can find. There's over 200 pages and almost every panel looks exactly the same. Each page mostly consists of 4 rectangles. There's some variations, but that's basically it. You really don't see anything in the gutter of each page. No blurring, no fluff, just the same basic structure over and over. Now, like I said, I don't want to spoil the manga, but there's 2 reasons why this seemingly boring paneling is genius. First of all, because we're told the main character is recording everything, it's hard to tell the difference between his movie and reality. As a result, you're constantly trying to decide what's real and what's a story. At the same time, Goodbye Eri is meant to be a commentary on the nature of movies and how people perceive their own life and the lives around them. So on a meta level, because you can't really distinguish fantasy from reality, Fujimoto sort of implies that this is the very nature of existence, an indistinguishable blend of fantasy and reality. But you wouldn't fully appreciate that idea without the boring paneling, which is exactly why Fujimoto is a genius. In a story like Chainsaw Man, he uses every part of the page to enhance the reader's experience. You can have a story with simple paneling like you see in a lot of shonen manga, but you're depriving the reader of the creativity that you can only find in manga. At the same time, you don't have to add a ton of detail to have good paneling. Like we can see in Goodbye Eri, paneling isn't just about what you show the readers. It's really about the way you empower fans to read their own story. But what do you think? What are your favorite examples of good paneling? Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And don't forget to become a channel member. You'll get custom badges and emojis, you can pick which series I cover next, and you can even get credited in future videos. Also, check out my other art videos, which you can find in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.